Well, blessed Tuesday to you as we come with your daily encouragement. And are continuing our series in First Peter. And we're coming into some sections that are probably the most controversial of the whole letter, even of the whole Bible to some extent, especially for Christians. They deal with slavery and they deal with submission. We're going to talk about each of those separately. Because in many ways, there's a difference between what we call worldly slavery and spiritual slavery. And there's a difference between submission in this world versus submission that we all are to have as believers, both to God and to each other. And so both of these topics are addressed in First Peter. So we have to listen to these words carefully because slavery also was in the Old Testament. So there's nothing necessarily new in the teaching. It just is an application that's slightly different. But there's also an example of not only slavery existing in the Old Testament, but God setting us free in the New Testament. So we got to ask ourselves, what about slavery is wrong and what about slavery is correct? Because to some extent, we teach that we are in bondage or a slave to sin, and we cannot free ourselves. And then conversely, Paul in Romans 6 describes us also as being a slave to righteousness. So there's a lot of doublespeak when it comes to both the topics of slavery and submission. So we got to listen to First Peter very carefully because they're kind of working with some themes that can have a very negative side and a very positive side, depending on how we apply them. And so it says here, slaves accept the authority of your masters with all deference, not only those who are kind and gentle, but also those who are harsh. Now, here we are not talking about setting yourselves up for political freedom. It is the assumption that there will be different types of relationships in this world. And Peter is not on the verge of starting a political revolution. He is on the verge of starting a spiritual revolution. So, and Paul does the same thing to some chagrin when he tells the slave Philemon that rather than asking for your freedom or shying away from your freedom, go back and submit to your master again and let your master legally set you free, which seems like horrible advice on many levels to our modern ear. But the principle that Peter and Paul are working with is that each of us are created for a specific place, and that it is a danger for us to seek a place that is not designed from God. And that is where we also, in our state of freedom, political and cultural, that we experience in our world, our modern world, we run up against something that infringes on our freedom that is a good. And that is God, who has created us to do certain things in this world, also created us to be enslaved to the thing that He has created for us and to submit to that. Some people take a lifetime to try to figure that out. In an interesting way, I have always sensed, in my case, that I was going to be going and doing something in the pastoral realm. And while that sounds like a lot to be set free as far as judging is concerned, I've often found it is a two-edged sword because it makes me into greater submission both to God and to other people. I find myself in many times, and I'm not complaining about it, it's just an example of not having all the freedom that people think I have. I do not only before God, but before other people and in my position. In fact, Jesus and Peter seem to discuss this at the very end of John's Gospel in the last chapter. There was a time where you thought you could go where you needed to go, and now, Peter, you are going to be submitted to go to the places that I send you. And so it is with slavery. Peter is not making a bold statement about setting political slaves free. He is talking about spiritual slavery. And he's basically saying, accept the authority of your masters with deference, not only for those who are kind and gentle, but those who are harsh. In other words, in general, our first act is to be submissive to those who are in authority. Now we are called with a greater action to pray our way, first of all, before we act. And that second act is not really brought up by Peter. But he has an assumption here. And it is the same assumption that Paul has. Paul believes that things can be settled peaceably first through prayer and through reasoning. That the harsh master will eventually lose their harshness when one sees that the person who is enslaved is a hard worker and is an honest person, and will by that character gain freedom. But Peter and Paul, to their detriment, do not get to that second stage of asking for political freedom. You see, first of all, you are asked in your heart to accept the position that God has for you, but to also know in your heart that that position is not permanent, because it is based on not the whims of your master, not the whims of other people's opinion, but on the action of God. And so I found that too, even in my life, where I've had to be and work sometimes with difficult people. And while I cry out in my heart for the injustice sometimes, and for sometimes why I have been placed with certain people, my first act needs to be out of love, needs to be out of submission, needs to be out of prayer. And so Peter is setting this up right here at the beginning. Slaves, accept your authority of your masters with all deference, and do not only those who are kind and gentle, but also those who are harsh. In other words, accept your position and then let the Lord turn it around. And sometimes that comes supernaturally by the work of prayer in many different cases. Everything from changing the mind of masters to having a slave being sold to another master who is much better for them, or in the cases sometimes might be harsh where the master dies. All of those are possibilities and probably others. But the key word is that we submit to our circumstances first as something that God is teaching us before we pray from our heart to set us free. God bless you today. We trust that these are words of encouragement. Take care. God bless. We'll be continuing on with these themes tomorrow. Take care.